it's definitely a pleasure to introduce a colleague and friend, Lori Quakenbush. She has a long history in Alaska, so I had a long scroll that I was going to read, but she asked that I not do that. But there are some definitely important things to mention about Lori. She's a wildlife biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. She also has an affiliate assistant professor status with the Institute of Marine Science at the illustrious University of Alaska Fairbanks. I don't know what she's more proud of. She got her bachelor's in wildlife at the University of Alaska Fairbanks and got a master's in biology at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. So I think we know where her heart is when it comes to rooting for hockey. And she's done some things that are pretty remarkable. She was the chair for the State of Alaska Board and Game for 4 years, 1997 to 2001, and it was good to work with her when she was chair of that. That was a very important position for her. She's also was on the board of directors for the Alaska Bird Observatory. So she's obviously playing a large service role in the wildlife arena. Her activities, I knew her when I came to Alaska in 1995. I knew her for doing a lot of seabird research. Then suddenly she was also doing seal research. She's been tagging and doing a lot of telemetry work on seals and whales, bowheads and belugas. And that's been very exciting research for her. And I've been following that as they've progressed. That's been very exciting, and a lot of method development that she's done there. She's also the program leader for the Arctic Marine Mammal Program, and they're doing a seal harvest biomonitoring, biosampling program where they take a lot of measurements, a lot of samples from seals, and they've been sharing those samples with a lot of scientists, and that includes our laboratory, and we're very grateful for that generosity. That's a very important program, and she works a lot with subsistence hunters. So today she's going to talk to us about beluga whales and her work with subsistence hunters and how well they've been able to work together to learn more about beluga whales in this state. It's a real challenge to work on beluga whales, and she's overcome a lot of those. So I hope you'll help me welcome Lori Quakenbush.
Well, those long introductions make me feel really old. Thank you, Todd. Appreciate it. And as Todd said, I'd like to talk to you about belugas tonight and what we're learning about them, what we know, what we don't know, and just sort of as much as I can cover in about an hour of interesting things about belugas. And one of the reasons we've been able to learn so much about belugas is that we're starting to work with the hunters more. And belugas are real important to the people who know them the best. The Latin name for beluga is Delphinapterus lucus, and that means a finless white whale. So that's the Latin name and where that comes from. What we know the white whales as are beluga, the Russian word, and beluga, which is also Russian, and there's two ways to spell it, two ways to say it. Most people go with beluga. And they're also called the white whale. And in Inupiat, it's Sisawak is beluga, and in Yupik, it's Sitwak. So pretty similar in the two native languages. Here's a map of the distribution of belugas. The dark blue, or kind of bright blue, is sort of the where belugas can be found around the Arctic. And the black, which is what we're looking at here today around Alaska, the coastal areas around Alaska. And that's mostly what we'll be talking about tonight. Female belugas become mature, or they can give birth to their first calf somewhere between 4 and 7 years old. And their average length is like 12 feet long, and they can weigh more than 3,000 pounds. So they're pretty big animals, but they're not that big for whales. Males don't become mature until later, 7 to 9 years old, and 13 feet is the average, but we can find belugas up to 17 feet as well, and well over 3,000 pounds. And belugas can live in the wild to up to 30 years old, although most of them probably don't live quite that long. And the females, once they start giving birth, can give birth every 2 to 3 years. And here you can see the calves are are gray or dark gray. Newborn calves, the newer they are, younger they are, the darker they are, and they gradually fade as they get older. Here's a young whale here as well, and then the white whales are the adults. If the light gray whales can be mature, we've seen light gray whales that also have calves, so they don't need to be completely white before they're able to have calves. And calves are 5 feet long and 100 pounds, so that might give you an idea. If you know how much you weigh and how tall you are, a baby beluga is 5 feet tall and 100 pounds. Belugas molt their skin once a year, usually in the summer months when it's warm, and they can put a lot of blood and actually grow new tissue. So their skin gets old, as you can see here on the top. Yellow, has kind of circles in it and splotches, just looks old. And they like to do this by rubbing. And once they rub the old skin off, they have really new white, shiny skin. And that's what these 3 belugas are doing. They're rolling and rubbing in this gravel and trying to get some of that old skin off and get their new skin growing. The belugas, their eyes are pretty small, and they have the front part of their head is called the melon, and it's actually a pretty sophisticated sonar device. They can emit sounds as clicks and whistles, and they can focus that sound by actually changing the shape of their forehead. And so sometimes if you see belugas in aquaria, their profile will actually look different than other times. They can move that melon around and focus sound. And they use that sound by putting it out into the water and then receiving it back. They can learn about what's in the water. And in a lot of the places that belugas feed and live, they are in very muddy, turbid water, coastal areas. So it's not someplace they can see their prey. They actually need to hear it or to listen for it, to know where it is and how to catch it. And belugas also have ears, and you might be able to see, can you see where the ear is on this beluga? Right there. They have just a tiny little opening that marks their ear. And there's a lot of people in Alaska that use beluga whales for food. It's a traditional food that people use. The muktuk's real important, and the meat's real important. And there was a group of hunters and scientists that were trying to learn as much as they could about belugas, trying to keep track of the numbers, wanting to make sure that the populations were going to remain healthy for the communities. And they developed a group called the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee. And the objectives of that committee were to be proactive about belugas, not try to react to low populations, problems, overharvest, those kinds of things, but to learn what they could and be proactive about managing the belugas wisely. And so their objectives were hunter education, protecting subsistence hunting and culture, research, and protecting beluga habitats. And they wanted to collect harvest records and be the contact for beluga information. And so that's basically what the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee does today. What I'm going to talk about tonight is the research that this group does, and it's a combination, as I said before, of scientists and hunters. And Kathy Frost in red there in the middle is my predecessor at Fish and Game. So when she retired, I started working there in basically the same position that she had. And she's sitting next to Ross Schaefer, who was the president of the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee for a number of years. And he was also voted, I think, Best Hunter of the Year once at AFN. So he hunts both seals and belugas and has a very keen interest in the health of the populations. So some of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight are stock structure. It's what we know about whether all of the belugas are from the same population or whether they're from different populations. And that's important to know for harvest, and we're using genetics to learn about that. We also look at abundance, how many whales there are, and we're using aerial surveys to do that. Keeping track of the harvest. The hunters are reporting their harvest annually at the Beluga Whale Committee meetings, and so that's being kept track of as well. And we've been doing a fair amount of satellite telemetry, trying to learn about movements, where belugas go, what they do, where their important habitats are. And then we're also getting diet information from the harvested animals from the stomach contents, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So to start with stock structure and a little bit about genetics, most people have heard about DNA and DNA fingerprinting and that sort of thing, and we can get DNA from skin from harvested animals and from live animals in some cases, and it can tell us whether belugas harvested in different places belong to the same population or not. And knowing this is important to management and maintaining sustainable populations. So when we first started talking to people and looking at where people saw belugas, the traditional knowledge, what the people who hunt them and the people who live along the coast know, is that they would see belugas in these areas, these red areas, in the summertime, and that was where near some of the villages and where people would do their harvesting. So that was one thing that we knew, was where we'd see them in the summertime. And then from aerial surveys and shore-based surveys and some other things, there were also some movement, places that belugas were seen moving from and to. But nobody really knew how much these populations in the red areas might be related to one another. So you could see that how, if you're harvesting animals right here, say at Point Hope, you don't necessarily know whether it's the ones from here coming by or the ones that go over here coming by this way, or if these are maybe the same as these, those kinds of questions, because it's important to know if you have a small stock or a small population, what's being harvested out of that. So one of the things that the Beluga Whale Committee decided that they could do as a group is the hunters could bring in skin samples from all of the harvested whales. And they were very happy to do this. They were interested in the health of these populations and what might happen. So at every annual meeting, the hunters would bring in skin samples, and we'd give those to the geneticist, and he'd take a look at them. And this is what we found. In looking at mitochondrial DNA, which is the genetic part that's inherited just from your mother, so it's only the female line, you can get these different haplotype frequencies. So if you look at each color on each of these bars is a different haplotype. And what makes the populations different is the frequency of these colors. So you can see that for Cook Inlet, a real sort of important part of that population is a lot of these blue haplotypes. And for Bristol Bay, it's a lot of these orange haplotypes. And so from each location where the hunters brought the samples, we started to make these pictures and understand these populations better. So one of the questions was, and what people thought from looking at where belugas went and what they did, we thought that these two places, the animals would look the same. They'd be from the same population. But when you look at the haplotypes, here's the Kotzebue Sound one, and here's the Point Layer Casa-Gaelic Lagoon. And they're obviously very different. So from the genetics, we found that those two populations were different and not the same. Sort of the opposite thing was at Point Hope. We had the haplotypes look like this, and also in the Beaufort, they look like this. So what we found was that belugas going by Point Hope are actually the same belugas that go into the Beaufort Sea. So now the picture looks a little bit better, and we have more comfort in that these animals are different from these animals, and the ones that are harvested right here are actually an interception of the ones that go all the way over here. And this is a very large population. So we're starting to learn a little bit about where people harvest belugas, what population those belong to. The Kotzebue Sound is very different from everything else, and we're still learning about, we need more samples from there to learn about whether that's its own stock or whether it's a part of a different stock. So there might actually be 6 stocks instead of 5, and we've always thought there were 5. In some of the places where we want to get more genetic information and we're not getting enough from the harvested animals, we can actually go out with biopsy tips and crossbow set up and get samples from live animals. And so we're expanding that and using some opportunities to do that. So for instance, in Bristol Bay, we were very interested in getting some samples from there, and we thought we'd try to get samples from live animals. And we set up our biopsy tips on the end of our crossbow arrows that float, and we went out with some of the hunters, and we were boating after belugas, and this is what we saw. Very little to aim at, lots of rough water to be holding your crossbow, and we shot a lot of arrows into the water and didn't get any skin samples. So next we tried to sit next to the beaches where we knew the belugas came close to shore, and we were going to try to see if we could get some skin samples that way. And the belugas came up just above, just one side of us or just the other side of us, and not close enough that we could get a good shot at for a skin sample. So this is Gusty Talakpalak, and he lives in Levelock. And after a couple of days of this, he just said, why don't we just do what we do when we hunt them, and I'll put your biopsy tip on the end of a stick, and we'll go out in the boat, and we'll herd them into shallow water, and you could just poke them with a stick. And I said, okay, let's try that. So that's what we did. And the way the hunters in the Kvichak River hunt belugas is to go out in the boat, find belugas, and herd them basically, or move them into shallow water. And so Gusty set up basically a stick, exactly what he said, with our biopsy tip on the end, and we tied it to the boat so that if I dropped it or threw it, we could grab it and pull it back. And I think the first day we got 13 samples, so he definitely had the right idea. And one of the things that's really interesting about belugas and the way the hunters go after them in boats is that the boats actually run out of water at the same time the belugas do when you're working them in shallow water. But the hunters know very well how much water they can go on in their boats. And what they do is they fake the beluga into thinking that it has to turn. And as soon as the beluga turns, it runs out of water and strands briefly. And so it's floundering around trying to get back into deeper water. And then you can glide up with the boat, get your sample, and then back away. But it's such a similar water depth that if the boat actually turned, it would ground as well. So the boat has to make the whale think that it needs to turn, but the boat can't actually turn itself. And they're very good at doing this and getting us close to the whales. Another thing that we can do with some of the beluga, the skin samples, is there's a way to look at old skin as well. And we went back in time at Casagalic Lagoon. There's an old village site, and there's some old beluga tissue there. And so they did the same haplotypes with dried tissue, and looked at what that haplotype looked like just to see if through time the genetics was changing. And it wasn't significantly different from like 1979 to 2000. So there's quite a few things we can do with skin samples and looking at genetics. So as I said before, the other important thing is to know how many belugas there are in each stock, so you know a little bit about what your harvest level is. You can tell trends, whether the populations are growing or not, and we've been using aerial surveys to do this. So if you're flying over in a plane and you see belugas, this doesn't look too tough, right? You can count all these belugas. Even these, which are underwater, you can see See, I thought there was another one, this one too. Underwater, you can see them just fine. They're all lined up, pretty easy to count. Has anybody counted them yet? 16? Okay, how about now? This is a more typical situation. We have muddy water. Some of these belugas are actually making the water muddy. They eat some of the small flounder in the mud. They chase after them, scoop things up, make the water all muddy. And the other thing, in muddy water, what you actually see when you're flying over and looking at belugas is you see the white oval of their back, and they go like this. So you're seeing them, not seeing them, seeing them, not seeing them. So about the time you're trying to count them, they disappear, and then something else comes up. And if you wait too long, you're not sure if it's the same one or a different one. And so there's lots of techniques that we're working on to figure out how to count belugas and how to correct the count once you've counted them. So if you see this many belugas, how many are really there? And there's lots of ways you can try to get better at getting a good estimate. But sometimes it's not quite as easy as it seems like it would be. And knowing how many belugas are harvested is important. And the hunters are very good about reporting their harvest at the annual meetings, and they actually will report their struck and lost rate as well. So at the annual meetings, they'll come and they'll say, you know, the village of Levelock harvested 4 animals, 3 grays, 2 males, 1 female. You know, they'll give us basically gray whales, a subadult, white whales are adults. We get that kind of information, sex and age class, and how many were not retrieved that were harvested. And they recognize this as important information for everyone. If the struck and lost rate gets too high, they would work with their fellow hunters to bring that down, try to figure out why that was happening. They work with a management plan. Within most of their villages, they have an actual management plan. They all agree to harpoon the whales before they shoot them so that the whale can be tracked and retrieved. So they're very careful about retrieving the whales that they strike. And I'll go through one community that does a community whaling, has a community whaling effort every year about the 4th of July. Most of the villages, the hunters will go out as a boat or two. They'll hunt with a couple of families or just a couple of hunters. They'll bring back 1 or 2 whales and share that with their family members or the community. In Point Hope, which is also called Casagalic Lagoon, they do it as a community, and they have a harvest captain who's in charge of the whole harvest. He'll direct up to 10 boats. And in Point Lay, the belugas come from the south and they go by the village, and the main village is on the mainland, and there's a series of barrier islands. And so the belugas would normally just go by on the ocean side and never come near the village. So the hunters will go out and see where the belugas are, monitor that, and when they start getting close to the village, they'll go out in a group of boats and they'll escort the whales to the lagoon entrance, and then they'll turn them into the lagoon. And so they'll turn some portion of what the migration is into the lagoon, and they'll have a community harvest. And they harvest between 25 and 35 whales a year that way. They do it as a whole community and share the meat. And this village doesn't hunt bowheads. They do some seal hunting and a little bit of walrus hunting, but belugas really provide the majority of the meat for this village. So the harvest is done by most of the community. The meat and the muktuk are piled up on the grass and then distributed into basically piles by the mayor. And here's the mayor standing right here, and he's calling out meat, and the young men will actually walk to each pile and drop a piece of meat so that each pile is basically made up of the same thing, has the same amount of muktuk, the same amount of flipper, the same amount of meat, because people like all the different parts, and so each of the piles becomes available for each family. And the families have 24 hours to bring their meat and muktuk back to the village, and if there's anything left this is the old village site, then whoever wants to take it or needs it can go back and take what was left. So all of the meat and muktuk are gone within 24 hours. And then it's prepared at the homes. And beluga meat is very well liked as dried meat. It keeps very well, and people like to take it with them on hunting trips. So they'll dry it and put it in Ziplocs and freeze it, and then take it with them when they go places. And the muktuk is also dried, and you'll see it hanging out to dry near the houses on drying racks. And here's a list of 38 communities that I know hunt beluga whales in Alaska. And while I was making up this list, I thought of a couple others. I know Iliamna also hunts belugas, and there's probably more. So there may be 40 or more villages in Alaska that find belugas are important for food and for their culture. And see, Anchorage is one of them. We don't normally think about Anchorage as a village, but there are a lot of native people there that do still collect natural foods. And we'll talk a little bit about the Cook Inlet belugas, which is where Anchorage hunts. So here's some of the numbers, some of the things we understand about belugas. The Beaufort stock is the largest stock, and there's probably 40,000 belugas there. And this is sort of a compilation of harvest numbers for a 15-year period. And if you look at the number harvested in this column and the total number of whales and the percentage that's being harvested, in none of these populations is it close to, say, 3%, which would be a reasonable, sustainable level for a population or for an animal like belugas. The Cook Inlet population is the one that I think people hear the most about. It's been a declining population. It's the one right in Anchorage. Kind of travels back and forth between Kinnick Arm and Turnagain Arm. And those whales were harvested at a pretty high level for a while. There was a commercial outlet for the meat in Anchorage. People were hunting both because they liked the meat, but there also was a commercial sale. And it was thought that they were over-harvested for a number of years before anybody really understood how large the population was. And the harvest there has been curtailed considerably, although not stopped. The Tyonek hunts there, and so does Anchorage, and they alternate every year, one beluga per year. So one year Tyonek gets a hunt, and the other year Anchorage gets to hunt. And even though the population is small, it's recognized that beluga meat is very important to people, both for nutrition and for culture. And so they're going to continue that hunt as long as it's not actually a part of the cause of the decline. And with the limit in the hunt, everyone expected that this population would grow quite rapidly, and it didn't, and it's actually declining still. So now the scientists are looking at what other things might be wrong there. And of course, if you hear about Anchorage, there's potential for the bridge to be built. There's a big sewer plant right on the edge there. There's Ship Creek, the big harbor. There's lots of activity there, that might be causing some issues. But we really thought that with the decrease in the harvest there, that the Cook Inlet belugas would be doing better, and they're not. There's a couple of other things that can happen there. Belugas strand pretty frequently around Anchorage. The tide system in Kinnick Arm and Turnagain Arm is pretty major. I know if you've ever driven around Turnagain Arm and see when the tide's out, you don't see water anywhere, and when it comes in really fast. Belugas following fish up the rivers will try to wait as long as they can and eat as much as they can, and sometimes they don't get out in time. The water goes out faster than they do. Some of those animals make it, and some of them don't, but there is a high stranding rate there. So that might be something. Another possibility is killer whales. People are looking at whether the incident of killer whales coming into the inlet. Killer whales are a major predator of belugas in all places. It's partly why we think they hang out in these coastal, shallow water areas in the summertime. So those are some things that might be happening with Cook Inlet whales. The other thing that we're doing is satellite tagging in order to understand movements, where belugas go. We don't know much about where they go in the winter or what they do. So we're using satellite telemetry to learn about that. But satellite telemetry works really well, but you still have to catch the animals to put the tags on. So here's Gusty again in this boat, and his job is to separate whales so that we've got a net that we're trying to put around a whale to catch it, and we don't want two whales because 3,000 pound animals in the same net is a little more than we can handle. So his job is to separate the whales from each other, and then let the net boat come and set a net around the beluga. And here's the beluga right here. So you can see the muddy water. Basically all we're looking at is what we call a track or a wake. And in shallow water, the belugas make this mark, and you can keep track of them that way. In deeper water, you don't see anything, and you can't find them, and it's pretty easy for them to get away. This hoop net inside this rubber boat is what we call a head net, and that is to go over the head of the beluga. So once it's caught in the net, we can control it with that, take it out of the big net. We also put a tail rope on so that we can control the whale and tie it to the rubber boat. So here's a tail rope on this whale. He already has a transmitter on, and once the transmitter's on, and we'll let him go, and he'll be able to swim right off from here. This transmitter we call a spider tag, and it's just called a spider tag because of its attachment, and it has these cables that can attach it to the back. And this was a whale we tagged this year in Nushagak, just outside of Dillingham. As you can see here too, muddy water and nice big whale. This is Albert Simon from Hooper Bay. He hunts belugas and seals there. This is Ben Tinker from Aleknagik, which is up with the Wood River from Dillingham, and Fred Bartman, also from Aleknagik. So these two guys were local, knew the river really well, which is really important. The weather and the tides can be a really difficult place to work. So if you know, like if the wind's blowing this way, we can work over here. The tide's going out, we need to get out of here. We're not going to have any water. So these guys, once I saw what the Nushagak was like, I realized that we would be probably still sitting out there on some sandbar if it wasn't for these guys. They definitely know their river. And this is Albert with a head net on this whale, and this is a different kind of attachment. We call this a side mount, and it just sits on the side of the dorsal ridge. And all of these tags are pinned through the muktuk with actual nylon pins. And here's some of the information that we're getting from these tags. These are whales that were tagged right here at Point Lay. And in 1998 was the first year that whales were tagged here, and they went all the way up to 80 degrees north. And this dark yellow is heavy ice. It's more than 60% ice. And it was very unexpected for us anyways to see those whales go that far north under ice. We weren't sure what they were doing up there, what they were eating. There's Arctic cod there, it's deep water, but that was fairly unexpected. So we went back in '99 and tagged some more, and they did basically the same thing. So it seemed like that's what belugas do at Point Lay. But then in 2001, tagged whales there as well, and saw something a little bit different, a lot more coastal. This is shallower water zone, movements out into the west. Western Chukchi Sea, nothing as far north as 80 degrees. And 2002, similar, not much into the heavy ice, more shallow. And when we looked at these data, we saw that the early years were males. The majority of those tags were males that came through Point Lay first, and the later ones that stayed close to shore were females. So we're actually seeing some sexual segregation in where the males go versus where the females go for this population. Here's what we found from the whales we tagged in Dillingham. So we tagged 5 whales right here, and in September through November they stayed pretty close to shore and pretty much within the Nushagak Bay area. But then in December and January, we have only 2 whales still on the air, and their movements are even outside the bay. But it looks like winter time, they're not too far away from where they are in the summer, and they're still spending a fair amount of time in Bristol Bay, and that the Bristol Bay whales maybe aren't leaving there. This is a young whale, a subadult. You can see from his gray skin, and you can also see this whale hasn't molted yet. He's got some old skin, and you see a lot of these round patches when the belugas have their skin's old and they haven't molted yet. So this is the color of a subadult whale, more gray than white. And this satellite package, this transmitter we call a saddle tag, and we're not using these anymore. This is an older one of the first designs. And Cook Inlet whales were also tagged, and we found some movements for those. We found that Cook Inlet whales don't leave Cook Inlet. They stay there all year round. In the summertime, they move back and forth between Turnagain Arm and Kinnick Arm and well out into the inlet. In the wintertime, their core area is more in here and still up Kinnick Arm and Turnagain Arm, and that was pretty surprising to people. People thought if they were there in the wintertime, they'd be easier to see, and nobody really seems to see them there, but the satellite data show that these whales stay pretty close to anchorage all year long. And the other thing that we're finding out about is what belugas eat, and that helps us to understand what areas are important to them. Here's several pre-digested rainbow smelt, and this is the kind of thing when you open a beluga stomach that you might find, and they smell even better than they look, just so you know. The other thing that belugas eat a lot of is salmon, and in the Bristol Bay area, belugas have actually been thought to be part of the cause, if not one of the main causes of the red salmon decline. And belugas certainly can eat a lot of fish. I did one stomach from a Cook Inlet beluga that had 12 silver salmon in one stomach. And what belugas do when they eat fish or eat salmon, they have just pegged teeth, and they basically manipulate the fish so that they can swallow it head first, and they don't chew it, they don't rip it up, they'll swallow it, and it just goes right into the stomach, and then once they get to the next one, that one just goes right in next to it. And if you open up a stomach full of salmon, they're basically just packed in there right next to each other. So 12 silver salmon, I think, was over 60 pounds of fish in one stomach. But they eat other things as well. They eat shrimp, and they eat isopods. They eat little flatfish, like little halibut that live on the bottom, and cod. And these are squid beaks. And squid beaks are like the only hard part of a squid. Everything else that's soft gets digested, but the hard parts pretty much stay in the folds of the stomach longer, so we can look and see what belugas are eating. The other hard part that stays are the otoliths, and those are fish ear bones. Most of the fish have these hard ear bones, and while the soft parts in the bones, the rest of the bones seem to leave more quickly. We often get a lot of ear bones. And we can identify these ear bones to species of fish, and if they're not too digested, we can actually look at how large the fish was that was eaten from the ear bones. So we can learn a lot about what they're eating and the size of the fish that they're eating. And I don't know if people are familiar with squid beaks, but it's the mouth parts of the squid, and they have basically an upper beak and a lower beak, and we can get an idea, if they're not too eroded, how big the squid and what species they are. So we can tell a lot about these hard parts that get left behind. And there's a lot of people that have worked on these projects that I've described for you tonight, and a lot of cooperation, and just to name a few, the Alaska Beluga Whale Committee and the Beluga Hunters of Alaska and Canada. We work with the Canadian Beluga Hunters as well for that Beaufort population that's over in the McKinsey area, and have meetings occasionally with them as well. North Slope Borough Department of Wildlife Management, that's who Todd used to work for. They do a lot of work with the committee and with belugas. Bristol Bay Native Association has a Marine Mammal Council, and they're very active in the tagging, the biopsies, collecting stomachs and genetic samples. National Marine Fisheries Service, Alaska region, those are folks in Anchorage, and they study the Cook Inlet belugas, and are really helpful with all the other beluga projects as well. Southwest Fisheries Science Center, that's who does the genetics, so all those nice color bar graphs are made by them. And then the Marine Mammal Lab in Seattle, they also work with us on these projects. We've had a couple of University of Washington graduate students working on different projects, mostly at Point Lay, getting samples from that harvest. That's a wonderful place where you have 25, 30 belugas, and you can get a lot of samples from those animals that can tell us a lot about health and contaminants and those kinds of things. And the people at Point Lay are very gracious in letting us have those samples so we can all learn more about the belugas. And then the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, which is where I work, and I get a lot of support from them for this kind of thing too. So thank you. It's very good to see so many people.
Are there any questions out there? Just raise your hand, please.
Oh. I see one over here.
Are you studying contaminants in mercury and so forth?
The question is, are we studying contaminants with belugas? And the contaminant studies have been done with Alaska belugas, and the levels are low compared to anywhere else, and actually was found not to be a problem for the Cook Inlet decline. So we've sort of moved away from looking at contaminants and looking at other things, but it doesn't look like there's any alarming levels of any contaminants in the beluga whales that have been looked at. Question. Right?
How are the populations doing, other than, I think you commented on the Cook Inlet? Are the other populations doing okay?
Yep, the other populations are doing fine. Some of them are easier to count and keep track of than others, but it looks like our aerial surveys and other ways that we look at Bristol Bay looks like it's increasing, or has increased over the last 10 years. What we call the Beaufort Sea population, the one we share with Canada, is 40,000 animals or so. So that's a very large and looks like stable population. So for the Alaska stocks, the only population of concern is the Cook Inlet stock. There's some question about animals that used to come into Kotzebue Sound. Kotzebue Sound hasn't seen belugas come in there for them to harvest for a number of years, and nobody's quite sure why. The genetics for those animals are different from the others, but they haven't been named as a stock yet. There was one major entrapment event near there, but in the Russian side. And so there's one theory that it may be that a lot of belugas got trapped in some ice, and there was known to be a die-off, and those might have been belugas that come into Kotzebue Sound. So other than Cook Inlet, we're unsure about what's going on in Kotzebue Sound, but all the other stocks are healthy and stable or growing.
2 questions. What does the meat taste like, and how does it compare with other whale meat? And the second question, don't belugas sometimes go way up rivers?
2 good questions. The meat is actually very mild compared to other whale meat, and if I were to recommend a whale meat to start with, if you've never had whale meat, I would recommend beluga. It's very lean. All of the fat in marine mammals and whales is on the outside, so it's it's sort of difficult to cook. You have to be careful you don't dry it out and make it really chewy, but it's a mild tasting meat and it's quite good. The muktuk as well is mild and very good. So that's how it compares to other whales. Some of the other whales can be a little stronger tasting than beluga. And belugas do go very far up rivers. Not all belugas do, and it doesn't necessarily happen often, but it does happen frequently. They aren't required to stay in salt water for any reason. They're looking for food. If their food goes up the river, and they might go up the river right behind it. Most of the tagging we do is in river or estuarine, not very salty water systems. They've reported belugas up as far up the Yukon as Fort Yukon. So we definitely see belugas up rivers, and they're probably chasing salmon. We know salmon go up that high, and belugas certainly like salmon.
Could a baby beluga be smaller than 5 feet and 100 pounds?
It could be a little smaller than that, but if it was too small, it would probably be born too early and might not make it. So that's kind of the average size of a baby beluga. But maybe if the mom's the first mom and she's kind of small, she might have a smaller one.
Kasiakuk Lagoon was threatened by drilling. Do you think that the Chukchi population would decline if that happened?
There is a new interest in the Chukchi Sea for oil and gas, and they've already started to do seismic work out there last summer, and they'll do that again this summer. That's for leasing and for exploration. There hasn't been any leasing yet, so we don't know what kind of activity that's going to be, but certainly that's one of the things that we look at, and when there are leases and comments, we definitely comment for protecting the belugas and let people know the timing and the important habitats. That's some of what we're trying to find out by looking at the satellite telemetry, what path belugas take when they move, what areas they spend time in, so that if there's any real important areas out there, we can let oil companies know they need to avoid those areas. Good question.
When you spoke of the relative cleanliness or the lack of toxic accumulation in the Alaska populations, are you comparing those to, what other populations are you comparing those to? North Atlantic populations or?
Canadian high Arctic and mostly Canada, Greenland, where other studies have been done. And that's been true too for seals. We're finding lower contaminant loads for seals in Alaska than in Canada and Greenland. So it looks like the paths that contaminants take to get through the Arctic tend to, we're either at the end of the stream or for some reason farther from the source, so we're not seeing the high levels of contaminants compared to other places.
And that comment does bear obviously on the Anchorage sewage lagoon on Point Warrenzoff and so forth. The idea that that statement was general to the Alaska populations. How comfortable are you with the sample size of the beluga population there in Cook Inlet as far as toxics? You think that population is relatively toxic free?
I think what we need to do for Cook Inlet is look at different things. What we normally talk about with contaminants are organochlorines like PCBs, DDTs, and heavy metals. And I think what might be happening in Cook Inlet, like with the sewage lagoon, might be something different than that, more bacterial, those sorts of things. And I know there's a proposal that's gone in right now to look at sort of health screening of belugas and to compare a healthy population like Bristol Bay with what's going on in Cook Inlet. So it's sort of different than the contaminant question, but you're right, it's still potentially a toxicity issue or something, that's in the environment that's not healthy for the animals. Does that answer your question?
Do you see any mixing of the population groups at all?
Well, the different haplotypes that I showed with the different colors in the bars, they are shared between the different groups. And the way the geneticists would describe those colors, it's like family names. So you'd have like the Smith family and the Nelson family, and it doesn't mean that in a stock that there are no Nelsons and they're all Smiths. It just means that you have a higher proportion of one or the other. So there is some mixing between them. We do see, haplotypes that are shared by the different stocks. So there may have been mixing in the past, or there may be some mixing. It's the preponderance of the frequency of the different haplotypes that tell you whether this stock is different from another. So there either has been in the past, or there may still be some mixing, but the majority of the animals seem to, stay within their stock.
Just to ask about that, the stocks that beluga that was found between Fairbanks and Anana got a lot of local publicity. Any chance that the stocks that came from have been identified? Presumably, a lot of the Yukon ones might be consistent with that one. So,
right.
Which stock, or did you get data?
The only thing I got was the stomach, and I did look in the stomach, and that animal had eaten salmon and a marine fish, walleye pollock, which it probably ate before it got into the river. Somebody else probably took a skin sample, and I'm not aware if that's been typed or not. But on the Tanana would be related to the Yukon. It's potentially a Yukon animal, but I'll have to ask the geneticist whether he got that sample and if he's done it yet. So I don't know the answer to that.
I can't remember what the haplotype was like for the Cook Inlet group. Is there anything in that genetic makeup that might relate to its ongoing demise?
That's something else that's an active proposal in the works that is being reviewed. But there isn't any information about that right now. This is the Cook Inlet haplotype, and it's got a lot of these blue, a lot of this blue haplotype. There are some genetic studies for small populations that do have some information about how you might just not have a good gene pool that you're working with, and there are some things you can study about that. And my understanding is this proposal that just went in to be funded is trying to look at that. So there may be some new information about whether there's some problems there with that stock. I'm not sure what you would do about it if you found that to be true, but that is something people are considering.
Does that stock seem to mix with others?
It does not. Yeah, it does not. It looks like Cook Inlet animals are pretty well isolated from others. If you look at, like, here's the Bristol, the next closest area is Bristol Bay, and they're very different in their haplotype of Cook Inlet. There are a few animals around Yakutat, and there's people have been out with kayaks and crossbows trying to get genetic samples from those to see if those animals, and they might be Cook Inlet animals that have gone, to the south and to the east, but we don't know very much about those, and that's a very small population that was known about locally for a long time, but people studying belugas in the rest of the state didn't know there was a population in Yakutat. And so they might be most closely related to Cook Inlet, but there's not enough of them there to help the Cook Inlet population.
You've shown us mtDNA here, and my question is how much chromosomal DNA you've looked at?
I think they're starting to look at microsatellites for some of these, but the mitochondrial DNA has actually worked very well for looking at the haplotypes and distinguishing the stocks. One of the things we're doing with the samples that we're getting from live animals is actually fingerprinting them and looking at using the genetics as a genetic mark recapture study. And so there's going to be some more genetic work done there. But there hasn't been a real drive to look at the chromosomal DNA or the microsats, and most of what's been done has been mitochondrial. Are you a geneticist? Okay. Yep.
You know how you said like where they stopped hunting and the whales didn't come back.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know they were scared off and like how they didn't like follow the fish? They hunted the fish too much and they went to the other place. And how do you know they didn't go back there? And how do you know they weren't scared off?
Yeah, we don't know that. That could very well be what happened. Belugas, if there's something to eat, they tend to be not very afraid of people, and they will go and hunt and pick up fish and be very focused on what they're doing. So certainly, if the fish didn't go back into Kotzebue Sound for some reason, the belugas probably wouldn't go back in there either. So that is a possibility that the food, the habits of the prey have changed, and so the belugas aren't going back in there. So we don't know that. That could be a reason why they wouldn't go back in there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, so when you say fingerprint, what do you mean, like, specifically?
See how many of them were marked. You can tell whether your population is large or small by how many marks you get back. And that's one of the things we're looking at doing with the biopsies we get from live animals. So in order to do that, we have to tell whether we've sampled the same individual again or not. And the haplotypes won't get us there. They'll only get us to the stock. So we actually look at it at a much finer scale and identify the individual.
I actually meant, like, how would you fingerprint a whale?
By looking at their DNA.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
I thought I was going, like...
Okay, I answered a different question.
All right.
Sorry.
Thanks, though.
Yeah.
All right. Thank
You're
you.
right. Belugas don't have fingers.
Thanks, everyone, for coming out.